Thank you very much for joining us today for this exciting Q&A session. I'm honored to introduce to you Gita Gopinath. Gita is the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. In that role, she represents the fund at multilateral forums, leads the fund's work on surveillance and related policies, and oversees research and flagship publications like the World Economic Outlook, the External Sector Report, etc. Before that appointment, she was the IMF Chief Economist, so in other words, Economic Counselor of the Fund, and Director of Research of its research department. Prior to joining the IMF, Gita was the Joint One-Strap Professor of International Studies and of Economics at Harvard University. Before that, she was Assistant Professor of Economics at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. So Gita's track record is impressive, both in policy as well as in academic research. She's an inspiring role model for everyone in the discipline of economics. We're incredibly fortunate to have Gita with us today to share her insights and discuss with our students. So without further ado, please help me welcome Gita to this event. So during the Q&A session today, we have two excellent students from our department and former members of the Student Economic Review. So as you know, the Student Economic Review is one of the oldest undergraduate journals of the world. We think it's the oldest. It was founded in 1987. With a reputation for academic excellence, the review provides a platform to showcase exceptional work being undertaken by our own economics students. So we're very, very proud of this effort. Every year, the SER has featured many outstanding essays. Today, former committee members or contributors to this journal are leading figures and innovators in the fields of business, finance, research, and academia globally. So today with us, we have two students. Saloni Khosla is a final year student of economics and mathematics, originally from New Delhi. She's currently working towards a specialization in microeconomics via her final year capstone dissertation. She also aims at attaining a master's degree in economics and sustainability. She served last year as the editor of the Student Economic Review, where she managed 8 colleagues and organized the publication of the review, as well as the launch event, which was graced by the presence of our alumnus and friend, Philip Lane, currently ECB Chief Economist. She recently completed a summer internship at Ernst & Young, and she was working there on business cases in various aspects, including health and infrastructure. Mark Heanue is currently final year of joint honors degree in economics and philosophy. As a copy editor of the Student Economic Review, he contributed to the publication of top essays written by students. He also contributed to the organization of notable SER events beyond the publication and the launch of the journal, such as debates against Oxford and Harvard, as well as guest speeches. Additionally, he was speaker at the SER debate against Oxford on the motion, "This House will abolish borders," earlier this year, and served as a judge in the European University debating competition in Glasgow earlier this year as well. So let's welcome the two students as well, and be organized in two parts. The first part will be led by them with a Q&A session, and the second part will be questions from the floor. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to you, and thank you everyone for joining.
Gita, a very warm welcome from everyone here at the college today, and I hope you're enjoying your time in Ireland so far. Could you start off by telling us a little bit about what the IMF actually does, your role as First Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and why you're currently in Ireland?
Okay, now thank you so much for inviting me on this, and thanks for the kind introduction. And it's a really great pleasure to be here. The first deputy managing director now is a mouthful. It's basically the number 2 at the IMF. That makes it easier to figure out where the person is placed. So in terms of what the IMF does, we were set up along with the World Bank 80 years ago, so this is actually our 80th anniversary. And the whole purpose of this was, we were coming out of the war, this is 1944, not yet over, the war's not yet over, but everybody figures that we need some institutions to make sure that we don't keep going to war. And we need institutions that can help with somehow bringing along economic and financial stability in the world, right? Ensuring that we have that. And so the IMF and the World Bank was created for that purpose. So what do we do as an institution? We do 3 things. The first thing we do is called surveillance, which is basically we track very closely developments in the world in terms of economic and financial developments in the world. We look at whether there's what's happening, are there risks of a financial crisis, what possible big economic events may be on the horizon. But we also do this country by country, so it's not just the big global picture, but we also work with our countries, 190 member countries, on an annual basis where we go do a deep dive on the economic policies that they've adopted, what they're planning to adopt. We have engagements. We put out a report for each of these countries every year where we give our own assessment of the economy, how it's doing, what we think is good policy, what we think is policy that would be useful for the country to adopt. So it's a whole bunch of policy advice that we also do. So that's one bucket. The second bucket, which is what usually the IMF is recognized by, is on the financing front. So we lend to countries. And if you want to think of what kind of lenders we are, we tend to be what I would call firefighters. So which is an economy gets into financial trouble. It doesn't have the resources to pay its bills, including, for instance, if it's importing oil for energy or anything else, or food, and it really is running out of currency to pay, foreign exchange to pay for it. So that's when countries work with the IMF. So we give them financing, and we work very closely with the countries to come up with a program that can hopefully durably get them out of the problem that they're in, and prevent them from getting back into the same problem. So that's one of the things that we do. Sometimes the problem is obviously not created by the country. A good example is what happened in 2020 with the pandemic. COVID came out of the blue. People had to send everybody home. Companies shut down, universities shut down, everything shut down. The economies went into lockdown, and obviously at that time it was a difficult moment. And the IMF was there. Since the pandemic, we have lent to, I believe, 97 countries. The total amount of that lending is around $350 billion. So we work very closely with countries in terms of the financing aspect. And then the third bit is what we call capacity development, which is we have several of our member countries, especially those from low-income countries, that need the help in terms of just setting up institutions. So, for example, if you have suppose you want to setting up a central bank, and the central bank's job is to control inflation. How exactly do you do that? What do? You wake up in the morning, and what decisions do you take? How do you make assessment? How do you actually implement the policy of your interest rates? What are you doing? How exactly are you doing? The nitty-gritty details, right? So we help countries who are still in the early stages of these kinds of institutions, build these institutions. Similarly, in terms of public finance, if you're deciding to do big infrastructure investment, how do you make sure you do it in a way that you don't, end up losing money? How do you make sure that you're giving it to, it's being done by, say, construction companies that actually will get the job done, and so on. So it's public investment management is another big thing that we do. So those are the three buckets. In terms of why I'm here in Ireland. One of the main reasons I'm here is to give the Whitaker Lecture. This is a lecture that the Central Bank of Ireland has every couple of years. It is to honor Ken Whitaker, who I'm not sure if you all know him, but you should know him if you don't. He is known as Irishman of the 20th century. He was a phenomenal public servant who was central bank governor, but also worked in the finance ministry, was also a senator, and is known for basically transforming Ireland's economic fortunes. So he was one of the people in 1958, 1960s, moved Ireland away from protectionism towards opening up to foreign investment, and that was a was a big deal for the country. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. I suppose a lot of what you mentioned there is related to economics, and a lot of us here today will be studying economics, or at least very interested in financial markets. Could you tell us a little bit about your studies and your journey to where you are today, and what skills and knowledge really helped you along the way, and what your particular interests and expertise in economics would be?
So I grew up in India, and I studied my first classes in economics were in India, in the University of Delhi. And I cannot say that I was wowed by economics when I went in. I actually, seemed like a reasonable thing to do. So I took up economics. What changed was, so I was an undergrad 1989 to 92, and 1990, 91 was when India had its crisis, its economic crisis, right? And it was very classic. It was a very classic crisis, the kind the IMF deals with, which is basically, India got to a point where it didn't have the foreign currency to pay for its imports. It was running out of it very quickly, and would have been running out of it by in 3-4 months. It wouldn't have had the import money to pay for it. And so the IMF came in. And in addition to the money, it was also a time of huge change in the Indian economy in terms of how the economy was viewed. So previously there were lots of very heavy state intervention in everything, lots of so-called red tape and bureaucracy, a very closed country, and working with the Indian government and the IMF together, they came up with a program that basically opened up the country. So this was a big change, and I was a student in the middle of this, and so this was pretty exciting. It felt like, okay, well, this seems like a fun subject. It actually makes a difference. And then I went on and I did my PhD and went into academia. So you asked about, in terms of the skills and what it takes. This changes over time. So in a sense, if I tell you what I tried to do in terms of skills, I don't know how helpful it's going to be. Let me just give you an example. So now, for example, randomized control trials in economics, especially in development economics, is a big deal. It's not something that we did. In fact, it's kind of interesting because when I was doing when I was studying and developing economics was being taught, it was very theoretical. It was mainly, you wrote beautiful models, you came up with conclusions what the models delivered, but it was much less in terms of, hands-on running experiments on the ground. And that's changed, and that's now development economics has a lot of that. Similarly, data science is we obviously did a lot of econometrics, but data science is the way it's being taught now is very different from the way it was done in the past. Now you have, if you look at universities, many economics departments have labs in economics, which is something that was never done. You never really saw economics labs. So now you have economics labs. You have, Racchetti has an opportunity lab at Harvard, where in a sense, as an economist, even in academia, you are managing, very large numbers of people working in labs and so on, which is more of a science thing to do, not economics. So the aspects of, the way you learn economics, what you want to work in, all of that changes over time. So I think my only advice is that whenever you decide to go into anything, and work on any topic, it has to be a topic for which the world can be better off with an answer to the question that you ask, right? I mean, which is you want to pick something that is, at this point, the world would really benefit from us knowing more about, and those topics change over time. So you should be motivated. It's not, economics is not meant to be able to demonstrate how much math you know, or how technically good you can be. It is meant to answer a question that would helpfully benefit society. So as long as you have that, you start with that, then of course whatever skills you need to pick up to be able to answer that question is part of what, those are the kinds of choices you have to make. I am in, I did international economics. The reason I'm an international economist was because of 1991, because that's when I was a student, and that's when I saw, it makes a huge difference what's happening in terms of your trade with the rest of the world, in terms of what kinds of capital flows you receive. So that's how I went into that area, and international economics, international macroeconomics, which is what I guess I was teaching at Harvard, is where I spent most of my time. One of the good things about having gone from academia to public policy, and I've been doing this now for close to 6 years, is I don't think I ever appreciated how useful economics is until I got the job in public policy. And that's helpful. So I think it's good if you haven't convinced yourself that economics is useful, then go ahead first and do that, because otherwise it feels like you're doing something that you're not very clear what the purpose of it is. And so I think it's extremely useful, and the world is changing so much. So for example, as an international economist, it's a huge change what's going on right now in terms of countries rethinking how they integrate with the rest of the world. We went through the 1990s on the way up until now, where it was pretty much agreed that it was good to trade with each other and to keep open economies and to rely on comparative advantage. And I would say, it started 2018, but I think now it's changed dramatically. And now we're in this space where countries are questioning the gains from all of that openness. Some of it legitimately, because of the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the gas shut-off that Russia did, obviously the consequences of that. So there are big questions related to it, including national security. So we're in this space where I don't think we're going back at all to what we had in terms of the kind of level of openness that countries had, but we're moving to a very different kind where countries are picking their friends, which sectors do you want to keep open, which ones do you want to close. These are kinds of conversations that we've never had. So I think it's a super exciting time for economists to think through how this will affect the world. That's just one example. I mean, there's climate change, climate adaptation, resilience, that's another big area. There's AI, another huge area, and the consequences that can have. So anyway, I think that's it. That's all I have.
Thank you so much for that, and I'm so glad you mentioned openness, because that leads perfectly to our next question. As you said, you've seen a backslide on free trade, there's rising geopolitical tensions, there's soaring debt levels across the world, and in context of that, what are your main concerns for the global economy at this moment?
So let me just elaborate on this. So in terms of I think the biggest question is this is a time where we are seeing big shifts in how countries are engaging with each other, and national security concerns are playing a very big role in determining economic policy, and you see that. So I think there are many more lawyers now just thinking about how to do economic policy than economists in several countries, if I may say that. That's playing a big part. So what is the concern? Because one is just recognizing that the arguments that were made in the past that economists focused on a lot on trade was all efficiency-based arguments, right? The idea was that what's the efficient thing to do? The efficient thing to do is to buy from the cheapest country that can produce it the most economically, the cheapest in fact, cheapest way, right? And that was it. And it didn't matter if you were, that was it. You relied 100% on that particular one country to supply all of your goods, all of your needs for that particular product. An example would be Germany relying on Russia for its energy. So that's what we did. I think we all economists can agree that we spent 100% of our time mostly focused on that. Now, there were questions that came about in terms of winners and losers within a country. That we understood very well. We were like, if you open up, then yes, the country as a whole gains, but there are going to be workers who are going to be negatively affected. There are going to be workers who are positively affected. We just made the argument that the overall cake just got bigger, so you could split it in ways and make everybody better off. That was we focused. So we understood, economists understood the fact that there would be winners and losers. It was not the case that the assumption was everybody would win. Now, what we didn't do very well was recognize how difficult it is to make the losers whole, and to make sure that you didn't end up with leaving people behind. And the policies that exist to do that are not that easy to do. And so that's one reason of frustration that's come around with trade, the inequality aspect and the fact that governments haven't been able to fix that and do a good job. The second thing that we simply, I don't think spent enough time, or we just didn't, was that we did not think about the world that we're in right now, where you're going to get, Germany gets completely shut out from gas, from its gas needs from Russia, right? So I'm just thinking that in many years I have taught, and the many discussions I've gone to, I don't recall ever seeing a presentation where this questions of resilience, that you have to be careful who you're trading with, ever came up. That was partly because we were in this world of multilateralism, and there was no reason to think that this would be a major concern, that it could be fringe, but not central. That's changed. I think it has become quite central now. And so, the good thing is, of course, it is important to pay attention to resilience and to make sure that it's not just that you're getting it from the cheapest source, but you're also getting it from a reliable source. I think that's an important point. The concern, of course, is that this good concern over resilience and in some aspects national security is getting mixed up with another big, long-standing worry, which is mostly tied to protectionism, which is the sense that we would like to keep all the jobs at home, and for some reason to keep all the jobs at home, we shouldn't be trading with other countries. And so that's getting blended up, and I feel at the end of the day we're going to end up with overdoing it. And unfortunately, the countries that are going to be the worst hit are developing countries, which do rely on open trade for their growth and for their prosperity. So that is, I think, one big concern.
Thank you. And speaking of winners and losers, I think it's really important that we touch on the topic of AI as well. And there's a lot of fears around AI, especially amongst the developing world. And I just want to know your opinion on, do you believe there's much truth to these fears when it comes to AI taking away jobs? And if there is, do you think that countries, especially developing countries, do they need to be changing their social security nets or training their workforces in a different way to adapt to this?
Yeah. So yes, AI, the new kid on the block, right? It's what everybody's talking about, and it is certainly, what we economists call a general purpose technology, which means a technology that can affect pretty much every aspect of our lives. It could affect the jobs that you're in, it can affect how you get your health care, it can affect how what your banks do, your financial institutions do, every aspect of life. So it is general purpose. It's one of those very wide-ranging technologies that potentially can do it. Now, to start off with, there's tremendous uncertainty about how quickly it's going to transform things. How good is it going to be in terms of raising productivity, or how bad is it going to be in terms of effects on jobs? Tremendous uncertainty. There's all kinds of predictions people are making on what can happen. I think we should just keep in mind that nobody really knows. I mean, this is very, very difficult to gauge. So again, besides the fear, I think there is the opportunity. One of the big problems that the world is struggling with is that there's not enough productivity growth. So, hey, if this technology can raise productivity growth, that would be wonderful. So there is a promise. There's also the promise of being able to come up with new kinds of ways of solving disease, including cancer and so on. And so there's a lot of promise that goes along with it. But yes, there's also the big concern. The question that you would hope one would try and get an answer to that really matters for knowing what the effects are going to be is how soon will all of this get adopted, right? Now what we've seen in the past with other kinds of general purpose technologies is that it takes a long time. It takes 20 years before you really see the economy being transformed by this technology. If it takes 20 years, then you have some amount of time to figure out how to adapt, people adapt, economies adapt, so it's a bit slow. I think the fear right now is that all of this might happen much faster. And if it happens much faster, then I think we're just generally not that prepared for that. But we don't know in terms of how quick the adoption will be. There are several who think it will be very fast. I mean, as you can see, especially the people in tech believe that anything is possible in 2 years. But it's still early days. But what we have done at the fund, obviously, is because this is one of our jobs, surveillance, is to pick these trends and see what's happening, is we've done a couple of things. One is to look at what the potential impact could be on jobs. So what do we mean by that? We mean, you take every occupation, you see what's the ability of AI to affect that occupation. So if I take the specific case of Ireland, our estimate is that about 60% of occupations will be impacted by AI in Ireland. Now, 60% is not all bad. 60% means that of the 60 percentage points, 30 percentage points is good in the sense that it complements the worker in that occupation, and the other 30 percentage points is not so good in the sense that it tends to substitute the worker in that occupation. Right? These are big numbers. If it is indeed the case that this much of change happens, it's big. But again, the question is how long does it take? And we don't know. We don't know how long it will take. But this is the scale at which we think it can affect. In terms of developing countries, I think there are there's again the plus and the minus. I think on the risk side is that there are developing countries, obviously, where you don't have enough jobs being created. And also because of a skill mismatch in terms of the skills of the workers and the jobs that they need. So there's not enough of that happening. Now we've gone through a wave where manufacturing, like car manufacturing, basically got automated. AI has the potential of services now being automated, and so the question is, where do the jobs come from for workers? So I think that's one big area of pride. Also in terms of they relied on outsourcing of service jobs to developing countries, from advanced economies being outsourced to developing countries. That can change. More of the call centers may disappear and so on. But on the plus side, given there are skills shortages in many of these countries, AI can help with, in that sense, expanding the availability of skill. Right? You can have one doctor be able to be much more effective because of the technology in multiple villages and so on. And so that's a big plus. Be able to provide more skilling. Also in terms of governments and how to do more effective governance, in terms of also tax collection and so on. So there are many things that can be done on the positive side. I mean, as of now, I think what's critical, there's a lot of summits that are happening which are mostly focused on ethics-related questions, on misinformation, all of which hugely important, or on weapons and so on. Again, all of it is hugely important. I think what the world also needs is to focus some more on the kind of the plain economics and finance of AI, and I actually see now more and more discussion around this.
You mentioned the IMF is through your surveillance role, looking at the potential benefits of AI. I just want to ask, do you envision that the effects, the disproportionate negative effects of AI on developing countries, how do you forecast those effects? And also, is the IMF in any capacity be able to kind of equalize that?
I think the second one, I would say no. In terms of the impact on developing countries, again, just in terms of the scale of exposure, right? So if you, like I said, for Ireland, 60% exposure of occupations are exposed to AI. If I were to do the same thing for low-income countries, we're talking about like 27% or something. Why? Because a whole bunch of their workers are in agriculture, and at least this current crop of new AI that we have is not exactly going to affect if you're an agricultural worker. So it's a smaller pool of workers that will get affected, but which then means that there's less of a big transformational effect through the labor market. But at the same time, there is another flip side of looking at it, was that these countries are not prepared to benefit from AI. So we've actually, I would recommend that you look at it. We put together an AI preparedness index, which looks at, I think 170 plus countries, and looks at how prepared they are. There are 4 things that matter for how prepared you are. One is your level of human skills, human capital, education, and so on. The second is how dynamic your companies are in terms of innovation, how can they adopt it. The third, of course, is your digital infrastructure, whether everybody has access to high-speed data and so on. And the last is what kinds of laws do you have that help with proper regulation, and so that it gets adopted in a way that benefits society. And not surprisingly, developing countries are not very prepared for it. Ireland actually is up there; it's among the top 25, so it's actually pretty prepared in terms of preparedness. So they don't necessarily give the big positive transformation effects, at least through this particular channel. But on the other hand, they may be a little more protected in terms of the transformation.
Thank you.
Moving on now to a bit of a different topic. As we're all aware, there's currently a crisis in the Middle East with what's happening with Palestine, Israel, Yemen, rising political tensions in Iraq. What would be the effects of this, do you think, on global trade and global growth, and what might the IMF do in response to this?
So, in terms of just the Middle East, first of all, it's a terrible humanitarian tragedy all around. I mean, if you look at both in terms of what happened in Israel, but also following that, what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza, the number of deaths is just really a scale that's unimaginable, and that's very really tough. What are the economic consequences of it? I would say the economic consequences are at this point, fairly concentrated to those countries that are involved. So Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. That's where you're seeing the biggest effect in terms of economic consequences. The fact that this particular conflict has not become a regional conflict, which is what many people were worried about, including us, means that as of now, the consequences for the rest of the world have been fairly limited. I mean, the one main channel through which we could have seen big spillovers to the rest of the world was if it became a wider conflict and that caused oil prices to go up very high levels, above $100 a barrel and so on, that would have big consequences for other countries. But right now, I mean, if anything, oil is down to 70, it's below when the whole conflict started. So that's not the case. But yes, so where are we seeing the effects in terms for anybody else? It's through the shipping lanes. So if we have another thing as part of our surveillance, we have this Port Watch website that again I encourage you to go take a look at, where we track shipping through different routes. And if you see what's happening, for example, shipping going through the Suez Canal since the conflict started, no, not since the conflict started. If you look at it in August this year compared to August last year, it's about 70% below what it used to be in terms of going through the Suez Canal. And instead, it's all been rerouted through the Cape of Good Hope. So that has gone up by around 50%. So there's been this rerouting, and that's leading to increasing shipping costs. That's putting some pressure on inflation, particularly in Europe, but not by a big amount. But again, and as long as it's a contained conflict, it's the spillovers to the rest of the world are not that big. How are we helping? We are working with many countries in the region. We have a program where we are providing financing, for example, to Egypt. That was before the conflict, but it's still there. We work closely with Lebanon. We don't have any program right now with them, but we work with them closely, but also other countries in the region. So that's what we do.
Europe is also experiencing a bit of instability at the moment. What do you think are the biggest threats to European economic sustainability? Are they related to geopolitical factors, competition-related factors, or are they to do with integration?
Well, firstly, I think we should say that the EU has survived some pretty hard knocks in terms of the pandemic and the Russia's war. I think both of that, the pandemic hit everybody, including my part of the world, North America, very badly. But the energy crisis that came following the war was hit Europe much harder than, for example, North America. So despite all those knocks, it has come out. It has shown resilience. It has, yes, economic activity is still recovering. It's not as strong as it is in the U.S. at this point, but still, these were very tough knocks, and the EU has done really well. So I think we have to first recognize that. In terms of the big challenge, I would say the number one challenge is that Europe has a productivity problem, which is it needs higher levels of productivity growth. Productivity in Europe is about 75 or 78% of what it is in the US. And the big gap, the reason there's the big gap is really focused on tech sectors. So there is a very, very strong, vibrant tech sector in the US, very high productivity growth. Most of the productivity increase in the US is coming from those sectors. A similar thing doesn't exist in Europe. So the priority has to be raising productivity in Europe, and then the question is how to do it. And I would say there's one singular reform that's important, and that is deepening the single market in EU. But that would be what would give the biggest bang for the buck. It has, there are still barriers to trade within the EU. If you can remove more of those barriers, that means just companies are dealing with a much larger market, and that scale is important to be able to become very efficient and very productive. So concrete examples would be, for example, electricity and telecommunications. If you open those up, you're going to get a much bigger market, bigger scale, more dynamism in the economy. The other big part is a capital markets union, so that you can get money going to firms that innovate. That's another area of work. Similarly, banking union. Basically there's a lot of savings in Europe, right? There's a lot of savings. It's just making sure that savings goes to especially innovative sectors, which just doesn't happen as well here in Europe as it does in the US. That would be another big area.
Yeah, so you kind of already answered my next question, which was basically, I was going to ask how Europe can reinvigorate itself. But how might this be different for a smaller economy like Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to benefit Ireland to have this kind of a stronger single market. It just has a bigger, it can also benefit from the scale of having a much larger market to work with. Ireland is a very open economy. It's one of the reasons that Ireland has done so well. And for me, countries like Ireland should be out there making the case for remaining open and for reminding everybody of the benefits of economic integration. Of course, to do that, obviously there are reasons why, as I mentioned previously, that you need to change some of the things in the way trade was done, but not end up going down a slippery slope and basically throwing out all the gains from trade. So I mean, that's my hope.
Great, thank you.
I also think it's important to talk about Europe or the Eurozone in the context of the larger global economy. And I know that the ECB very recently cut its interest rates in light of slowing inflation and faltering of economic growth as well. But there does seem to be a mismatch between these rate cuts between the Eurozone and America. And what impacts do you foresee of that?
I actually think that was a bigger concern a couple of months ago, that there might be a mismatch in the trajectory of monetary policy between the US and Europe. I think that's less of the case now. So, for example, I think it's pretty certain that the US Fed will cut rates tomorrow. The question is what the magnitude of it is going to be. But just given how inflation has behaved in the US and how inflation has behaved in the euro area, I think I don't see that much of a divergence in terms of what's going to happen with monetary policy. So it's a good question, and it was a particular concern 2 months ago. And if you had asked me 2 months ago, I would have said, yes, it's possible there could be a divergence, but it's not a big deal for Europe. And now I would say it's even less of a deal.
Thank you. Now, a bit of a different topic for our last question for today, and that is climate change, something I know that I'm deeply concerned about, and so are many, many people in our generation. So first of all, I want to ask you about your projections for how climate change will impact the world economy in, say, the next 20 or 50 years, and what kind of measures do you think the IMF will be taking in the future to protect countries against climate change?
I was hoping we would end on a positive note, but this is not going to end on a very positive note. So on climate change, unfortunately, we've set targets. Well, the scientific world has set targets. Ideally, we would like the increase in temperature to be contained between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. And for that to happen, carbon emissions should be net zero by 2050. So those are the goals. And so we can look at what countries have announced that they're going to do and whether that lines up with the goals. So if you want to get to net zero by 2050, you need carbon emissions to come down by between 25% and 50% by the end of this decade, which is by 2030. If you look at the plans that, the national plans that countries have put out to say what they're going to do on the climate front, and if you add up the numbers, that's the best case scenario, you end up with 11% decline in carbon emissions by 2030. Right? So 11% versus what you need is between 25% and 30%. And and that might be concerning. What's even more concerning is that countries are not even doing what they said that they were going to do. So we're probably going to end up nowhere near what is needed. So that's the glass half empty. The glass half full is that I do think we're in a world where, on the plus side, technology is doing incredibly well in being able to come up with new forms of alternative energy. And so there, the prices have dropped quite a bit. I think it's done more than we expected it would do. So what do we need? And there's COP29 that's coming up this year. And so what do we need? Firstly, I think we just need a big upping of ambition, because we just know this is not going to be enough. The ambition that's on the table is not going to be enough. It's upping of ambition and, of course, follow through. Because if you don't follow through, it doesn't happen. Second, climate finance is going to be a big deal. The need in terms of the financing that's needed is very large. I think it's about 800 billion or so that's going into renewables, going into greener forms of energy. The estimates are that it needs to go up to around 5 trillion. So we're way short. So a way of being able to get more money going towards climate mitigation, this is just climate mitigation. Climate adaptation is another big deal. But climate mitigation is, you need to make that happen. There's been some progress. There was a promise that was made in the past COP rounds for advanced economies to provide about 100 billion to developing countries. That hadn't happened for many years, but now it is happening. So that's, I guess, good news. What what we are doing at the IMF is, again, we're contributing to this by, we've created a new facility called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We set it up in 2022, where we lend to countries, mainly low income and also middle income countries that are very vulnerable to climate change. We lend to them on a very long-term basis, which is not something that the fund has done in the past. So we lend to them on a long-term basis at concessional rates. We have about 20 countries that have availed that facility. The amount of money that has been committed is about 9 billion. We have another 30 countries that are still want money, want access to that facility, right there in the pipeline. Now, all of this said, as you can see, these numbers are small relative to the 5 trillion number that I talked about, which means that the biggest bulk of this will have to be done by private sector, by private investment. And the only way we can get that to happen is if there are very clear signals sent to the private sector that this is the transformation that we're on. We incentivize them, either it's the carbon pricing, so that they respond to it, but very clear policies, macro policies, climate policies, that send a very strong signal that this is the direction of travel. That's going to then incentivize the right amount of private investment in climate finance. In climate, sorry.
Very good. So thank you so much, Gita, for answering this wide variety of questions. So as planned, we are going to take some questions from the floor. So if you can just raise your hand, and we can take 2 or 3 questions. We have one over here. You get the microphone here. This one in the front of you.
Thank you so much for taking our questions. The Economist recently put out an article over the weekend titled, quote, "The IMF has a protest problem," in which the paper suggests that some of the reforms the institution demands as conditions for its loans often lead to instability, with recent examples like Kenya or Bangladesh, and that in turn can lead to a government that's wary of reform and hurt the institution's objectives in the long run. What do you think is the right balance for the IMF between not compromising on its principles of tough but necessary reform and ensuring the local population and government are kept happy and stable?
Yeah. Should I answer or recollect?
As you prefer.
Yeah. Well, I can be try to be telegraphic. So this is a challenge that we always face when the IMF goes to help countries. Like I said, we are firefighters, which means that it's a very difficult situation for the country, and our goal is to help put the country back on a sustainable path where it doesn't revert back into this. So when we help countries and we provide them with financing, one of the things there has to be an adjustment, because the reason the country is in the situation that it is in often is because they've made some bad policy choices, and there has to be an adjustment. But what we also do is, in addition to saying that you need to cut spending on X, Y, and Z, this is the change that's happened over the last 10 years, is to ensure that there is a minimum amount of spending that's maintained for the poor, right? And sometimes that minimum is higher than what the government was doing previously. So we're in that process. Now that said, so that helps the poor and very vulnerable, but then there is a whole middle class that is getting affected by the policies. Because somebody bears a burden, right? It's never the rich, and we're trying to protect the poor, but we can't protect everybody, but then there's no adjustment. So the middle class, and I think that is an important concern, and again, it's something that we recognize the hardship of the country, but it is an adjustment that we have to go through. One of the things that it's very important, and this is not necessarily our job, but it's important for governments, is to engage with civil society, to make the case for why these adjustments are needed. And what we have seen is that when the people trust the institutions of the country to do the right thing, which means that if you believe that's an institution that's not going, people are not going to take the money and they are going to, funnel out of the country, or that they have faith. They have faith in the leadership that's there. They have trust in the leadership, or they have trust in the institutions. Then they are willing to, say, well, I guess we have to deal with this, and then we will see how things go. So it's very important communication alone is not going to do. You need the right governance. So one of the things that the IMF is also doing is when we have programs now, we invest a lot in governance. So we make sure that the institutions transform in a way that people worry less about corruption, that there's lesser ways of meddling with these institutions, because you need those safeguards. If you don't have those safeguards, then people are much less willing to listen to tough advice.
Thank you. One in the back over there.
Hi, thank you for coming to Trinity. We're really welcome here. On the topic of Europe, last week Mario Draghi released quite a sobering report on the problems facing Europe, from the productivity you mentioned to the weaknesses in our capital markets. So my question is, do you think that the technocratic solution proposed is feasible, given that we're about 900 billion short, and also the rising wave of, right-wing populism in countries like Italy, France, and more recently the Netherlands?
So, as you heard me say earlier, the number one problem is the productivity problem, and that completely in line with the Draghi report. And the Draghi report also talks about deepening the single market as being one of the big reforms that's needed. Again, wholly aligned. There will be a need to have some targeted amount of EU level spending on certain areas, like infrastructure that crosses borders. Doing that at the EU level will be critical, including on climate. We see a targeted role for this. There is, of course, the question. There are details of how you're going to finance it and what's possible. But I think the important thing is there are many very pieces of that report, and they're all very valuable. I think it's important to make progress. And again, if you start with, I would start with the deepening the single market. There is momentum right now in terms of capital markets union. If that momentum can translate into actual outcomes, that would be great. So again, I think it's very important. I hear you on this, and what I think your point is, effectively saying that some of these recommendations are going to be very hard to implement politically, and that's going to be hard. So my point is that, let's maybe start with the ones that should be easier to implement, which are very valuable, and right there will be there are benefits from that, which we fully endorse in terms of the deepening of the single market, which would be very beneficial for productivity.
Thank you. We have time for yes.
In the last couple of years, there seemed to be some questions about the dominance of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency and a currency of trade. And I just wanted to know, kind of in an age of both rising geopolitical tensions as well as sovereign debt burdens, does the IMF have a stance on any certain currency as a dominant reserve currency, as well as what kind of research and outlook the IMF does on the dominance of certain currencies versus others in relation to some of your partner central banks who really care about these issues, especially when it comes to their political outlooks?
Yeah. So one of the things, when you were asked the question, what does the IMF do? If you go to our website, it would say that we oversee the international monetary system. Nobody has any idea what that means. But so that's our big job, which is that we look at the kinds of monetary systems around the world, including currencies, exchange rates, and so on. So the question on let's just look at factually, right? Where does it stand, the whole dollar dominance in the world? And has it been impacted by all the geopolitics we've seen? So if we've obviously tracked that, that's something that we do. So if you look at trade, you see the effects. You see that trade between geopolitically aligned blocs is holding up much better than trade across blocs that are not aligned. You can do the same exercise and see whether you've seen something happening in terms of the dollar. And as of now, not much, I would say, not much. what you have seen, but this has preceded the recent year time and has been happening over time, is China is using more and more of its own currency renminbi in its transactions with the rest of the world. Right? And you see that. But to become a dominant currency, at least in an accounting sense, and you become a dominant currency when other countries use your currency, right? So if when say India and Mexico trade, they trade almost entirely in dollars, even though neither side is the US. That you see very little for, not if anything at all, for China's renminbi. So that's not the case, right? So in that sense, the dollar is still dominant. The one thing that you do see a change in is you see more countries, especially emerging and developing countries, buying more gold. So their reserves, they're building up more gold in terms of their reserves, right? Now the question is, why is that? Some part of that could be hedging in terms of what can happen to the dollar. Right? So there is the dollar, there is gold with that. But otherwise, in terms of the big message, in terms of dollar dominance, the headline is, I would say at this point, not that much. And then to the question of what should it be in a normative sense, whether there should be a dominant currency or two or three, that's not something that we get into, and it's a pretty tricky question to answer. What we do know is that to become a dominant currency, there are a few things that you have to satisfy. One, you have to be fully convertible, which means that your residents, anybody in the world can exchange into or out of that currency. Also, free flow of capital, so capital flow goes easily, very deep financial markets, trust in the institutions, including the country's central bank and its fiscal capacity and so on. And all this is what it takes. So, I often get asked, oh, well, now that we have, cryptos, does that create a problem? Or if central banks start putting out a digital form of their currency, does that affect it? And it's hard to see how technology gets around this problem. And so, at this point, China it's not fully convertible, it's not very deep in terms of its financial markets, it has lots of capital control. So, unless those are if a country is able to move in the direction where it has a freely traded currency on the world markets, it's able to manage its economy despite having open capital markets and so on, frankly, the benefits of that just far outweigh whether your currency is dominant or not in the world.